The kitchen felt unnervingly quiet as my daughter-in-law's words shattered the air. Your son says we can't afford to care for you anymore. Still, I didn't flinch, just set the cup down, my fingers cold against the porcelain. As the harsh truth hung in the air, the smell of stale coffee mixed with something darker, betrayal. While the weight of it crushed me, something in me snapped. That's when I realized they weren't just cutting me out, they were cutting me off forever. And I was done giving. Before we begin, may I ask, where in this big, beautiful world are you listening from? It's always a quiet honor to know who's sharing this space. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The kitchen had the quiet buzz of brunch leftovers. Half-empty plates, the sharp scent of coffee mingling with the faint bitterness of rejection. Danielle stood by the sink, her fingers delicate against the rim of the porcelain cup, like she might break it if she squeezed too hard. Her voice, however, was unyielding. Your son says we can't afford to care for you anymore. The words hung in the air, sharp as glass, cutting through the warmth of the morning light filtering through the window. Marietta didn't flinch, but something tightened in her chest. She set her napkin down slowly, the motion precise, controlled. What? Marietta's voice was steady, but her gaze sharpened. Danielle, looking too composed, met her eyes without a hint of remorse. He said it. We're not financially able to take care of you any longer. Marietta turned her head, meeting Ethan's gaze across the room, his back to them as he polished silverware with a mechanical air. He didn't turn when she asked, but his shoulders slumped slightly as he muttered, It's true, Mom. He didn't meet her eyes. The silence afterward felt like the weight of years, pressing down harder than any of the debts she'd paid or sacrifices she'd made. Marietta watched him, her only son, the boy she raised alone, the man who now couldn't look her in the eye. His face was a study of avoidance, a mask of guilt so thick it was almost suffocating. Marietta's hands tightened around the edge of the table. She rose slowly, as if every motion was weighted by the gravity of his words. Outside, the garden spread wide. Each stone of the patio they'd built together now seeming like a betrayal. Every inch of the space, every plant, every corner of her home was a reminder of what she'd given to them. And now it wasn't enough. Without another word to Ethan or Danielle, Marietta walked outside. The air was thick with humidity, but she welcomed it. The warmth felt fitting for the coldness she had just heard. Elena found her there later, sitting in the wrought iron chair by the garden table, her hands resting on the stone, tracing the jagged edges. She hadn't noticed her granddaughter approach until Elena's soft voice cut through her thoughts. They said you'd be okay with it. Elena's tone was cautious, unsure of whether she should speak the truth or shield her grandmother from more pain. Marietta looked up at Elena, her expression unreadable. They assume a lot, she said, her voice a quiet storm. Let's correct that. Elena sat beside her, the two of them staring at the garden in silence. The moment hung between them like the stillness before rain. Marietta's lips tightened, and Elena could feel the shift inside her. Her grandmother wasn't merely hurt. She was calculating. Do you want me to? Elena began, but Marietta was already reaching for the phone in her pocket, her fingers brushing the cold metal as though she had anticipated this moment for years. The call connected, and Reverend Cole's familiar voice crackled through the receiver. Marietta? I need to make some adjustments, she said, her voice even, the weight of her decision cutting through the calm, as though she had been preparing this for far longer than either of them knew. Adjustments? Cole's voice was softer now, a mix of concern and understanding. Marietta, are you sure about this? I'm sure, she replied, the finality in her words leaving no room for argument. I'll come by soon, he said, though his tone suggested he already understood the inevitability of her choice. Marietta hung up without another word, her gaze still fixed on the garden, her thoughts already moving forward, piece by piece, with the quiet precision of someone who had been wronged beyond measure. Elena, unable to contain her concern, spoke again. Grandma, are you really? Marietta turned to her, her eyes colder now, hardened by the sting of betrayal. They thought they could take everything, Elena. And now they'll see what happens when you try to strip someone of their dignity. Her voice softened just enough for Elena to hear the quiet pain beneath the rage. I've given them everything. It's time they learn there's nothing left to take. The garden felt smaller now, the stones heavier beneath her feet. A breeze stirred the leaves overhead, carrying with it the faint scent of rain. But in Marietta, there was no storm yet. Only the stillness of someone who had finally decided to reclaim the ground beneath her. As Elena rose to leave, her grandmother's voice followed her into the house, a final sentence hanging in the air. "Call Cole back. We're starting from the ground up." A chill ran through Elena, but she knew her grandmother meant every word. As the door closed behind her, the house felt emptier than it ever had before. Marietta sat at the kitchen table, a stack of papers in front of her, each one a relic of past decisions, choices made, sacrifices given, now reduced to cold legal terms. The will, her legacy. Ethan and Danielle, listed as the sole heirs, were named in sterile black ink. Her fingers traced the edges of the page, moving slowly, methodically. Each name felt like a weight, each line an echo of promises never kept. She remembered the down payments on their homes, the tuition checks for Ethan's schooling, the countless gifts that had gone unacknowledged. For years she had supported them, expecting nothing in return but the comfort of knowing she'd done her best. But now the comfort felt like a lie. Her gaze lifted, and the garden beyond the window seemed to mock her. The stone patio, the plants they had picked together, it all felt like a betrayal now. A knock at the door broke the silence. It was Cole, arriving as expected. His presence was quiet but steady, a constant through the years. He stepped inside without a word, his eyes briefly flicking to the papers scattered on the table. "Shall we?" he asked softly, his voice carrying the weight of unspoken history. Marietta nodded. No more hesitation. She had made her decision. Cole sat down, his hand brushing over the papers. "Are you sure about this?" "I'm sure," Marietta replied, her voice cold with finality. "It's time to start from the ground up." Cole didn't question her further. He understood her resolve, even if he didn't fully agree. He folded the document, placing it gently into his briefcase. Later, Clara arrived. As she always did when Marietta needed someone to steady the storm, she sat beside her, her presence a quiet reassurance. Together, they began to go through the receipts, emails, and photos Marietta had collected over the years, proof of every unreturned favor, every dollar spent without a single word of gratitude. Clara's voice broke the stillness. "They've never seen what it cost you," she said, her tone matter of fact. "But they'll learn now." Marietta didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. Her gaze lingered on the stack of papers in front of her, the silence between them a testament to everything that had been given and taken. Elena entered the room quietly, her expression one of cautious understanding. "Grandma," she began, looking between the women, "can I help?" Marietta looked up at her granddaughter, her face softening, though there was a quiet resolve in her eyes. "What do you mean, darling?" "I want to help draft the legacy letter," Elena said, sitting down beside her. "They left you a long time ago. You don't have to leave them anything." A faint smile tugged at Marietta's lips, bitter and knowing. "You're right," she said, nodding. "They don't deserve it. I've already given them everything." Elena took a deep breath, the weight of her grandmother's words settling between them. She picked up a pen and began to write, each stroke of the ink a step towards something that felt like justice. Marietta watched her granddaughter, feeling something shift inside her. The anger that had simmered now settled into a calm certainty. This was how it was supposed to be. She was done giving without acknowledgement, done with the quiet erosion of her dignity. She would leave a legacy of her own making, one that Ethan and Danielle would never claim. The sound of a door closing echoed through the house, and Marietta stood, her hands steady. There was no more room for doubt, no more room for their expectations. She had already decided what they would learn too late. Comfort is not a contract. As Elena continued to write, Marietta's eyes turned toward the window, her thoughts already moving forward. The garden outside seemed to fade away, just like the idea that they could keep taking from her forever. A knock at the door interrupted the moment, pulling her back to reality, but Marietta knew it was time. Time to reclaim what was hers. The first photo appeared early that evening, a picture of a lavish dinner table set with gleaming plates and glasses of dark red wine. The caption read, Cheers to family. Marietta's fingers tightened around her phone as she stared at the smiling faces of Ethan and Danielle, seated together at the head of the table. She recognized the wine glasses, her own, the steak, the bread. They had all come from her. She had furnished their home, helped pay for their life. But now, as she looked at this image of joy, she realized something. It was all hers. But they were the ones sitting at the table, celebrating without her. Clara, sitting beside her, read the caption aloud, her voice dry. You ever notice they only thank you after the check clears? Marietta didn't answer. Instead, she scrolled through more photos. The empty, joyful faces of her son and daughter-in-law flickered across the screen, each one wearing a mask of gratitude that only appeared once her resources were already spent. The hurt was gone now, replaced by something colder, calculated. Her fingers moved automatically, swiping through the photos, not feeling the ache, only the firm sense that this was the final straw. They had used her. They had taken everything without ever saying thank you. Now it was time to correct that. You're right, Marietta said finally, her voice hard. She stood up, walking over to the table where the will sat, waiting for her attention. Cole had already left, the documents now in his hands, prepared for their final step. But she couldn't wait any longer. She turned to Clara. It's done. Clara didn't ask questions. She'd known this moment was coming. Instead, she reached for the papers, nodding silently. The estate was now divided differently. 40% of it would go to Elena. Another 40% would go to a coastal elder care nonprofit, a group working to rebuild the lives of women who had been forgotten by their families. And the final 20? The AME Church, where Marietta had spent her life, quietly giving without ever asking for recognition. But the changes weren't only financial. Marietta added a no-contest clause to the will, with Cole as the irrevocable executor, someone she knew would safeguard her wishes without hesitation. Her eyes lingered on the final line, the one she had written herself. Comfort is not a contract. It's a choice. You made yours. The words burned like fire on the page. It wasn't just about money. It was about her dignity, about reclaiming what they had taken from her, bit by bit, over the years. Elena entered the room just then, carrying a thick hand-bound journal. She set it gently on the table, her face soft but determined. I made this for you, Elena said, her voice quiet but strong. For your legacy. Everything you've never said. Marietta looked at the journal, the weight of it settling in her hands. It was the gift Elena had given her to capture the words she'd never spoken, the truths she'd kept hidden. Words she would write, not for them, but for herself. Her fingers brushed over the leather cover, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the quiet hum of something like peace. She didn't need to leave them anything anymore. She had already given them everything they would ever deserve. You don't have to leave them anything, Elena said, her voice filled with quiet resolve. Marietta nodded, her eyes fixed on the journal. I've given them all they'll ever get. The wind outside picked up, rustling the leaves in the garden. The house was still, waiting. Marietta felt the weight of her decisions settle over her like a mantle. It wasn't just about cutting them off. It was about what she would leave behind, what she would claim for herself. As the doorbell rang in the distance, a soft, almost unnoticed sound, Marietta stood steady and resolute. She was done. Her decisions had been made, and now the world would see the consequences. The evening air was thick, the weight of the day still pressing on Marietta as she sat at her desk, facing the quiet of her home. She had made the decisions, set the course, but now it was time for the numbers. It was time to lay everything out, every dollar she had given them, every act of sacrifice that had never been acknowledged. Her pen moved across the page, writing down the down payments on their homes, the tuition fees, the loans. Each entry a reminder of the years she had given them. Ethan's house in 2001, the $60,000 for the down payment, Danielle's education, $30,000. Over the years, it had added up, gifts for holidays, vacations, things they never appreciated. The final number, $412,800. And that didn't even include the hours of free childcare, the emotional labor, or the constant unpaid support she had given. Marietta printed the page, attaching it to a simple email titled Realism and Accounting, then hit send. She didn't expect a response. She didn't want one. The truth was out there now. It wasn't long before the inevitable notification appeared on her phone. Danielle had posted. The caption read, "Sometimes boundaries are the kindest thing we can do." Clara, who had been sitting beside her, snorted. Bless her heart. She weaponizes kindness like it's cutlery. Marietta didn't answer. She didn't need to. The post was just another reminder that, for all their talk of kindness, Ethan and Danielle never really understood what it meant to be grateful. Instead of replying, Marietta sat back and stared at the screen for a moment, letting the words sink in. Then she scrolled to another post, the nonprofit she had started funding. It was a thank you note from the organization she'd supported for women rebuilding their lives after elder eviction. The words were simple, but they carried weight. A donation from the Sloan family, a chance for women to rebuild their lives. Marietta's eyes softened as she read. This was her real legacy now. This was where her generosity would go, not to her son and daughter-in-law, but to the women who truly needed it. Women who didn't take her love for granted. Women who would understand the value of what she had to offer. Clara noticed Marietta's shift in expression. "You've done more for them than you ever did for your own family," she said quietly. Marietta smiled faintly. "I've given them everything, and they've never once appreciated it. But this I can give without expectation." She set her phone down and stood, walking to the window to look out at the garden. The stillness outside felt right, peaceful, earned. A small breeze lifted the leaves, and for the first time in a long while, Marietta felt the weight of everything she had given release. A knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. A courier with an envelope in hand. No return address. Her name was written across the front in familiar handwriting. Ethan's lawyer. She opened it slowly, her heart tightening as she read the letter. They were challenging her will. It wasn't a surprise, but the feeling still hit her hard. She had expected this, the entitlement, the greed. Her grip on the letter tightened, her thoughts crystallizing. They thought they could take everything. They were wrong. Marietta folded the letter neatly, her resolve hardening. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She was ready to see this fight through, no matter what. The phone rang, slicing through the quiet of Marietta's home. She answered it with the same resolve she'd carried through every decision she'd made since the betrayal. "It's Cole," he said, his voice firm but carrying an edge of concern. Ethan's lawyer requested a copy of the original estate plan. Marietta didn't flinch. She had expected this. "He's hoping I left something in out of guilt." There was a long pause before Cole responded, his voice measured. "It's not going to work. The will is airtight. They have no case." Marietta didn't respond right away, her eyes scanning the horizon through the window. But her thoughts were already drifting, setting a course she couldn't turn away from. "Let him waste his time," she said finally. "I'm done explaining myself." "I'll handle it," Cole replied. "But I wanted you to know." Marietta's gaze turned to the papers on the table. The legalities, the battles. They didn't matter anymore. Ethan and Danielle's attempts to disrupt her peace wouldn't succeed. What mattered now was the truth. Her truth. Cole's voice broke her thoughts again. "I'll also update the church board about the donation. It's her way of restoring dignity to a community that didn't forget her." Her fingers hovered over the phone for a moment. A small smile pulled at her lips. That donation, her legacy, was hers to give. Free of expectation or guilt. It was the one thing she'd done without looking back. Without wondering if it would be used against her. The phone fell silent, the only sound the soft hum of her thoughts. She needed to do something final, something that would give Ethan the closure he'd never sought. She opened a new document, her fingers steady on the keyboard. "Ethan, you did not fail me. You abandoned the memory of what I built for you." She paused. This wasn't a letter she had planned to write, but it had to be said. It was a truth he wouldn't want to hear, but one he had to know. "You abandoned me, the person who made sure you were never without. And for what? So you could build your life on my back and then throw me away when you no longer needed me?" Marietta's fingers moved across the keys, no hesitation now. The words were clear, and the pain of them felt like something she had to release. You chose comfort over family, and now you will learn what it means to lose it all. Her hand hovered over the send button. The finality of it was almost too much to feel, but she pressed it. Before she could settle into the weight of what she had just done, a notification flashed across her screen. Danielle had posted. Her message was as sharp as a blade. Elder guilt is a form of control. Let go. The words stung more than they should have. The audacity of it all. The way Danielle twisted everything, even now, to make Marietta feel as though she were the one in the wrong. Marietta set the phone down, her fingers curling into a fist. Let go, she muttered to herself. No, I'm done holding on to you. She stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. The street was quiet, the wind stirring the trees. It was calm, too calm. But in the stillness, she felt something shift inside her. Ethan and Danielle would never understand. They would never see her truth, no matter how plainly it was written. Marietta turned back to the room, her resolve hardening. She had cut them off. There was no going back now. The diagnosis came like a quiet echo, reverberating long after the doctor's words faded. Congestive heart failure. The words had no mercy, no space to breathe. Just a sudden awareness of fragility, the kind that doesn't come with warning, but with the cold certainty of something breaking, inside and out. Marietta sat still in the sterile office, her hands folded in her lap, every inch of her poised, controlled. She had expected this, in a way. The exhaustion, the shortness of breath. The days when even the smallest task felt like an insurmountable mountain. She had been living with it long before the diagnosis. Now it had a name, a truth. She didn't cry, didn't show the slightest hint of distress. Instead, she thanked the doctor with a polite smile, the kind that was too practiced to be sincere, and left the office without hesitation. There was no panic, no despair. Only the quiet acknowledgement that she had lived enough life to know how to make her own decisions, even if those decisions were more about the end than the beginning. A week later, Marietta moved into a private care suite, a small, elegant space she paid for herself. She didn't ask for help, and she didn't want it. The suite was modest, clean, bright, but private. It had everything she needed. The quiet, the privacy, the space to breathe without the intrusion of the world she had left behind. The first day was peaceful, almost too peaceful. She sat by the window, watching the trees outside sway in the wind. There was nothing left to prove, no more conversations to have. The world would keep turning, but she would stay in her own orbit. Ethan never visited. Danielle sent flowers the next day, a pale bouquet of lilies. The note attached read, "Hope this space is more comfortable." Marietta didn't react, but the cold irony of it stung. She placed the flowers on the windowsill and looked at them for a moment. More comfortable, she thought. As if comfort could be delivered in a vase. As if comfort was something you could simply buy. "They have no shame," Elena said one evening, her voice quiet but filled with disbelief. She sat beside her grandmother's bed, her eyes heavy with the weight of it all. Marietta's response was calm, almost detached. "Which makes me feel nothing," she replied, her gaze fixed on the window. She wasn't angry anymore. She was beyond anger. She was tired. Tired of the games, tired of the expectations, tired of the ones who didn't understand. There was no need to explain herself further. Elena understood, as she always did. In the silence that followed, Elena held her grandmother's hand. Both of them finding comfort in the stillness. Marietta had made one decision long before her diagnosis. She would take control of her story. The doctors could provide the care. The nurses could monitor the treatments. But her voice, her truth, would be hers to record. And she would leave it all behind for those who needed to know. Not for Ethan, not for Danielle, but for Elena. She set up a camera, an old familiar thing she had used once for family photos, and began recording. A video diary for her memorial. It wasn't meant to be a goodbye, not really. It was a message. Her final testament. The first video was simple, just her face, steady, with that calm look that only Marietta could wear. "Comfort is not a right," she said, her voice strong, unwavering. "It's a choice. You made yours. I made mine. And now I will live with the consequences. The words were hard, sharp, but true. The cameras kept rolling. She recorded one video after another, documenting the life she had led, the choices she had made. She recorded stories, memories, things that only she knew, and things that for too long had been left unsaid. The final video, the last one she would make, was for Elena. "You were the one thing they couldn't take from me," she said, her voice breaking ever so slightly. "I did everything I could to protect you from this world, and now I leave it to you to carry forward what I've built." She smiled faintly at the camera. "But you don't owe them a thing, not a single piece of what I gave. You are your own. Your legacy is yours to shape." She paused before pressing stop on the camera, her gaze lingering on the screen. The message was complete, and it was clear. Cole arrived the next day to review her advance directive. He moved through the pages with care, every decision already made, every field filled out, every option locked. "You've covered everything," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I'll make sure it's all in place." Marietta nodded. "It's done." And with that, it was. The final decisions had been made, the legacy sealed. There was nothing left but time, and for the first time in a long while, Marietta felt a quiet peace, knowing that she had reclaimed everything that was rightfully hers. Marietta sat at the table, the stack of cards in front of her. 2 decades of perfunctory thank yous. The cards came from Ethan, from Danielle, each one a well-worded, hollow gesture. "Thank you for everything, Mom. Your support means the world." She stared at the words, the weight of them making her jaw tighten. She had given them everything, and they had given her nothing in return. Without another thought, she set the first card into the flame of the nearby candle. It ignited quickly, curling and turning black before vanishing into ash. One by one, the cards followed, reduced to nothing but smoke, each one a reminder of their empty gratitude, now burned away. When the last card crumbled, Marietta exhaled, a strange calm washing over her. The ritual was over, the emotional weight lifted. She was done. Then she turned to the small envelope on her desk, a weight she'd been carrying for days. She took off her wedding band, her fingers brushing over it for the last time. It was no longer the symbol of love it had once been, but a relic of a past she was leaving behind. She placed it in the envelope and sealed it. To Elena. She paused, holding the envelope for a moment. She'd never planned to hand it over in this way, but now it seemed fitting, not because I died, but because I lived. Marietta set the envelope down and walked to the other side of the room where her linens and silverware sat packed in boxes. They weren't for family or for friends. They were going to the shelter she'd been funding for months, a place for women rebuilding their lives after abandonment. Her gaze lingered on the boxes. The things she had once thought irreplaceable were now just items, things that could be given away to people who would value them in ways Ethan and Danielle never had. Her new room smelled of cedar and lavender, quiet and clean, but it would never feel like home. It was a refuge, but not hers. The home she had built, the one she had filled with so much life, was still technically hers until the trust activated. But it didn't matter. That part of her life was over. The phone buzzed on the table, jarring her thoughts. It was a voicemail from Danielle. She pressed play. "I hope you find peace," Danielle's voice said, smooth and detached. "We've moved on." Marietta's finger hovered over the screen. We've moved on. From her. From everything she had given. It was almost laughable. Without listening any further, she deleted the message. She didn't need to hear anything more. She felt nothing. No anger, no sadness. Just an empty, final certainty. They had moved on from her, and now she had moved on from them. She stood up, her movements steady, and walked to the window. The world outside felt still, untouched by anything that had happened inside. She had made her choices, and they were hers alone. There was no more room for their expectations or for their false acts of gratitude. She had given them everything she could. Now she was taking back what was hers. The heavy cream envelope arrived at Ethan's door late that morning, an innocuous package that would, in time, unravel the false narrative he'd carefully built around himself. It was simple, no return address, no fanfare, just a thick envelope, smooth to the touch, with his name written in Marietta's unmistakable script. He hesitated before opening it, as if the weight of it, though light in his hand, might be too much for him to bear. Inside, the envelope contained a single sheet of paper and a ledger, its columns neat, its numbers precise. Marietta had never been one for unnecessary flourishes. She had always preferred clarity, even in the moments that stung. The first few pages were a detailed record of every dollar he had ever received from her. Every gift, every loan, every dollar spent. Down payments on homes, tuition payments, vacations. The numbers added up to a staggering sum, and the dates were all there, etched in meticulous detail. His eyes scanned them briefly, but it didn't matter how many zeros followed the decimal points. The numbers weren't what mattered. They never had been. He flipped to the last page, and there it was, the final line. Marietta's handwriting, steady and unyielding. Your debt was emotional. Your repayment was silence. The words hit him with the force of a punch, knocking the air from his lungs. He sat there, the ledger in his lap, unable to look away from those final words, unable to comprehend how it had come to this, how, after everything, the sum total of their relationship had been reduced to a silent exchange. Danielle posted on her Instagram later that day, as she always did, her words carefully curated for her audience. It was a photo of the sunset, glistening, calm, perfect. The caption read, "Some people age into bitterness." Ethan read the post, a bitter taste rising in his throat. It was too clean, too neat, too perfect, and yet it stung. He wasn't bitter, he was angry. Angry at the woman who had given him everything and in the end had left him with nothing but a ledger and silence. But then another post appeared, just a few minutes later, from Elena. It was a picture of her sitting quietly in the garden, sunlight catching the edge of her face. The caption was simple but direct. Some people age into boundaries. Ethan stared at the words, his stomach sinking. The counter to Danielle's well-worn narrative. Elena had always been the quiet one, the one who observed and understood things long before anyone else did. And now she was standing tall. She wasn't hiding behind false words. She wasn't shying away from what had happened. She was drawing a line, and it was final. Marietta had always been good at setting boundaries. She had drawn them around herself and her life long ago. And now, it seemed, Elena was following in her footsteps, taking the lessons Marietta had taught her and claiming her space in the world, just as her grandmother had. There was no bitterness in Elena's words. There was only clarity. Marietta, too, was finding her own clarity. The plans for her funeral were finalized now. A small, intimate gathering, no family eulogies, no speeches from people who had only come when it was convenient. She had been through enough of that in her life. It would be music-driven, a celebration of her life, not of the people who had failed to appreciate her while she was here. There was a part of her, though, that wondered if Ethan would show up. Or Danielle? Would they come, expecting something? Some last vestige of what she had given them. Or had they finally moved on, as they claimed? Marietta didn't care either way. The decisions had been made, and they were hers alone to carry out. She had nothing left to prove. The day of the service arrived, and the small chapel was quiet, peaceful. Marietta's wishes had been carried out to the letter. No crowds, no speeches, just the music, soft and solemn, filling the space with a gentle sadness that felt like release. In the back row, Elena sat alone, her posture relaxed, her eyes steady. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a beginning. She had been given everything, every lesson, every decision. Now it was time for her to step forward, with boundaries of her own. The door opened just slightly, as if by chance. Ethan and Danielle appeared in the doorway. Their faces were unreadable. They had come, but they had nothing left to take. Marietta's legacy wasn't one of bitterness. It was one of clarity, one that they would never understand, not fully. But Elena would. Elena always would. And that was enough. The quiet of the room was only broken by the soft hum of the air conditioner and the ticking of a clock on the wall. Elena sat on the edge of the chair, the letter in her hands, Marietta's final words to Ethan. Her voice was steady, but a trace of hesitation lingered as she read aloud the words that had become the undeniable truth for their family. Forgiveness isn't needed when I don't carry shame. Marietta, sitting across from her, allowed herself a small smile. It was a look of satisfaction, final, but not bitter. Just the quiet acknowledgement of a truth she had lived with for so long. She didn't need their forgiveness. They had abandoned her long before she'd made the choice to cut them out of her life. And now, in their eyes, she would be nothing but a memory. But in Elena's, she would live on, clear and unburdened by false reconciliation. "I've made my peace," Marietta said softly, her eyes meeting Elena's. "And I'm not looking for redemption. They are." Elena nodded, her gaze shifting to the window as she considered her grandmother's words. There was no anger in her voice, no trace of bitterness, only quiet resignation, the kind that came after the storm had passed and left nothing but clarity in its wake. The next morning, Marietta made one last revision to her will. It was a small addition, but one that made her heart settle in a way it hadn't before. She added a clause that would forever change how her name would be used. "Ethan and Danielle Sloan are hereby banned from using my name or likeness in any future real estate promotions, marketing, or any form of public advertising." She paused, looking at the words for a long moment, feeling a weight lift. They would never profit off of her again. Not her image, not her memory, not her name. She had given them everything, and now she was taking back the last piece of herself. Elena was beside her as she signed the document, the finality in her eyes as the pen moved across the page. "You've made sure this time," Elena said quietly. "I'm sure," Marietta replied, her voice firm. Later that day, Clara arrived with fresh flowers in hand and a bottle of wine tucked under her arm. "For your victory lap," she said, placing them on the table. Marietta smiled, a wry expression on her face. "Victory lap?" she repeated, taking the wine and examining it for a moment before turning back to Clara. "To subtraction. Sometimes that's the real legacy." The words hung in the air like a secret. Marietta had learned, finally, that sometimes the greatest act of generosity was taking away, subtracting the parts of her life that no longer served her, those who never appreciated her, those who had only taken from her. It had been hard, but it was necessary. For the first time, she felt light. That evening, the nonprofit she had funded for years hosted a dedication dinner in her honor. Marietta had declined the microphone. Never one to stand in front of a crowd for applause or thanks. She would not be remembered by words or gestures that others could control. Instead, she remained in the shadows, anonymously donating another significant amount to the cause that had given her life new meaning. The guests mingled, discussing her contribution without knowing her, without seeing the sacrifices she had made or the quiet pride she held in her decision. They didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. The legacy she had chosen was clear. It wasn't a legacy of real estate deals or shallow gratitude. It was a legacy of action, of helping those who truly needed it, not because they were family, but because they deserved it. As the night wore on, Elena stood by the door, watching the people who had come to honor her grandmother, knowing that for Marietta, this was enough. She would never need to be thanked for what she had done. The quiet, the absence of applause, was her victory. Marietta, now sitting alone by the window, felt it, the peace she had searched for, the peace she had taken back, at last. The world had tried to take everything from her, but in the end, she had reclaimed it. And for the first time, she could feel the weight of her choices settle into something real, something hers. The door to her past had closed, and she had no regrets. At 6:12 a.m., Marietta was gone. She lay in her care suite, the soft morning light filtering through the curtains, casting a calm glow across the room. Her body was still, a quiet end to a life that had been filled with moments of silence, sacrifice, and clarity. She wore her favorite robe, the one she had picked out for its comfort and softness, her hands folded neatly over her chest as though nothing had changed, as though she had simply decided it was time to sleep. Her face was serene, a faint smile pulling at the corners of her lips. The peacefulness of her departure, something that would never be fully understood by the ones she had left behind. Her final act of control, the quietest moment of all. Elena was the first to be called. She had been in the garden, sitting silently when the nurse came in, checking her grandmother one last time. The soft beep of the monitor, the stillness of Marietta's body, were the only signs that anything had changed. Elena felt it immediately, the absence that had been slowly creeping in, the stillness that had filled the room. She didn't cry. She didn't make a sound. She simply sat beside her grandmother for an hour, alone with the woman who had taught her so much. She could feel the weight of the silence between them, the finality of it. Her grandmother had always been the one who kept things close, kept things controlled. And now Elena had to do the same. The time felt too short, too quiet, too final. But she couldn't let herself mourn just yet. She had to make the call. Cole arrived soon after, stepping into the room with the soft assurance that had always marked his presence. There was no need for words, not yet. He moved quickly to the safe deposit box Marietta had prepared. It was all in place, every detail already settled in the church vault, ready for when the time came. He retrieved the will and the trust documents, his movements deliberate, careful. Marietta had been precise. She'd known exactly what she was doing. And he, as always, was there to make sure it was all executed without hesitation. He ran a finger along the seal of the envelope, pausing for only a second to respect the weight of what it contained. Back at the house, Ethan and Danielle were still unaware. They hadn't been called. No one had reached out. They would receive no phone call, no formal notification. Instead, a courier arrived at their door, just a simple envelope, addressed to both of them, sealed with finality. No fanfare, no explanation. Just an envelope, and whatever it would bring with it. The chapel was quiet, too. The pews were filled with those who knew her, those who had been part of her life. But there were no family eulogies, no speeches. There was no need for them. The program read simply, a life of design. Defined by discipline, nothing more, nothing less. The words were simple, but they captured everything. Clara stood at the podium, her voice steady as she read from Marietta's favorite quote. Generosity without gratitude is theft. The words filled the room, the truth of them cutting through the air with the precision only Clara could bring. It was the perfect sentiment, the one that had always resonated with Marietta, the one that spoke louder than any formal tribute or family declaration. Elena stood in the back, her eyes never wavering from the front of the room. She watched the guests, those who had come to honor her grandmother, but there was no need for her to speak. The legacy had already been set into motion. Her grandmother had given everything, and now it was Elena's turn to carry it forward. As the service continued, with the music swelling in the background, Elena felt the shift in the air. The door opened, just slightly, as if they had only come out of duty, out of obligation. Ethan and Danielle stood in the doorway, their faces unreadable, still and quiet. The room seemed to hold its breath. They had come, but they were too late. Marietta's legacy, as it always had been, was not theirs to claim. Ethan and Danielle sat across from Cole, the will spread out between them like a map of everything they had lost. Cole's hands were steady as he flipped through the pages, his voice calm but laced with an unspoken finality. "There's no challenge clause," Cole said, looking directly at Ethan. "No loopholes. This is it." Ethan's face twisted, his mind already racing for a way to undo what had been done. But there was nothing. No words, no actions, no legal maneuvers. Marietta had thought of everything. Danielle's hands gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into the wood as she processed the words. Her face was cold, unreadable, but the veins in her neck were taut, as if she could feel her grip on control slipping. She couldn't have, she muttered, mostly to herself, her voice low, almost threatening. She wouldn't. But Marietta had. The house, the trust, the jewelry, the art collection, all of it was gone. Elena had inherited it all. The nonprofit Marietta had been quietly funding for years received its largest donation to date. The church received its share, the final portion of her estate, a final act of generosity, one not motivated by blood, but by something deeper. Danielle's rage simmered under the surface, but it was not something she would express in front of Cole. She would have her private time to deal with the sting of this humiliation. but the words that escaped her lips as she stood up from the table were more venomous than anything Ethan had heard from her in years. "She weaponized dying," she hissed, her voice shaking with anger and disbelief. "She waited until the very end to make sure we couldn't fight back." Ethan didn't respond. He just stared at the papers, the words on the pages sinking in like sharp needles into his skin. There was no fight left to be had. It was over. But as they stood to leave, a quiet whisper from Trevor, a distant cousin, found its way to Ethan's ears. Trevor had always been the type to avoid confrontation, to linger on the edges of things, but now, in the wake of all that had happened, his words cut straight to the heart of the matter. "She warned you," Trevor said softly, almost apologetically. With how little she said. "You didn't listen." Ethan swallowed hard, the sting of it sinking deeper than he cared to admit. He had been warned. He just hadn't been prepared for how thoroughly Marietta had cut him off. Elna was in her room later that day, the weight of it all settling on her like a shroud. She hadn't expected the estate to come to her, not entirely, but Marietta had made sure of it. Elna had always been the one who stood in the background, observing, listening, quietly absorbing everything. But this was her moment to step forward. It was her legacy now, not one of bloodlines, but of actions and choices. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the final letter from her grandmother. It was sealed, just as Marietta had sealed her decisions. The weight of her words unspoken but clear. Legacy is not blood, it's behavior. Elena closed her eyes, feeling the weight of those words wrap around her, holding her steady. It was a truth that Marietta had known and lived by. And now Elena would carry it forward, not just for herself, but for the people who had learned from Marietta's example. At the funeral, the chapel was quiet, except for the soft murmur of the crowd and the gentle hum of the music. People had gathered to pay their respects, but most of them did not understand. They didn't understand the woman who had been so quiet, so controlled. The true scope of her generosity, of her quiet strength, was lost on most of them. But Cole stood up at the front, his voice steady as he spoke on behalf of the church. "We thank the donor who remembered us," he said, his words carrying the weight of truth, even when her family did not. The finality of it echoed in the room. Marietta had not been remembered for her money or her possessions. She had been remembered for her choices, for the quiet legacy she left behind. And now it was Elena's turn to carry that legacy forward. As the service ended, Elena stood by the door, the weight of the future settling into her chest. She wasn't just carrying a name, she was carrying everything that Marietta had built, everything she had taught her. Ethan and Danielle, standing at the back of the room, watched as the last of the guests filed out. They had come, but they had nothing left to claim. They had been cut out, not just by the will, but by the choices they had made over the years. They had never learned to appreciate the things that truly mattered. Elena walked toward the door, her eyes steady, her footsteps firm. The past had closed its doors. Now, the future was hers to shape. Danielle's tribute appeared on social media that afternoon, a glossy image of Marietta's home, expertly curated to show the perfect family moment that had never existed. The caption read, "In memory of a woman who gave everything, but who never asked for anything in return." It was carefully crafted, with a forced note of sorrow that masked the calculation behind it. Yet it was too late. The tribute was flagged and swiftly removed from every platform for violating Marietta's posthumous wishes. A second attempt, just as polished, was blocked within hours. The algorithms didn't care for her words. They only recognized the finality of the will. Danielle, seething, stared at the notification on her phone, her fingers trembling as she reached for another glass of wine. She couldn't understand why everything seemed to slip through her fingers. Why had Marietta chosen to leave her nothing, her family, her name, her entire legacy? It was now in the hands of Elena. The very woman who had been so quiet, so easy to overlook, now held everything that had once been hers. Meanwhile, in a small office, Ethan sat in silence as a letter from the lawyer arrived. His hand shook as he opened it, his heart racing as his eyes scanned the letter. It was straightforward. Any further attempts to use Marietta's name or likeness in public promotions will be considered defamation and subject to legal action. The words were cold, final, and marked by the unmistakable seal of her revenge. He sat there, the weight of it settling in. Marietta's final strike was not an emotional blow, but a material one. It wasn't her love he had lost, it was her legacy. And now, with no recourse left, he would have to live with it. The phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Elena, with a message he wasn't prepared to read. She had posted a tribute, her own tribute this time, but it wasn't a polished narrative of her grandmother's life. It wasn't for show. Instead, it was a simple image. Elena sitting with Marietta as they painted a wall together. The caption read, "My grandmother taught me to paint walls in silence, to build quietly without expectation. This was her legacy. A life of action, not words." The post exploded. Thousands of people engaged, sharing their thoughts, commenting on the simple beauty of it. The nonprofit shared it in their newsletter, as a testament to Marietta's quiet generosity. The way her actions had spoken louder than any words. The outpouring of support was genuine, without fanfare or ulterior motive. It wasn't Marietta's money or her possessions that had inspired them. It was her choices, her dignity. Danielle saw the post too. Her jealousy flared again. But this time it wasn't just envy, it was defeat. The world had seen the truth, and Elena was carrying it forward without her. No matter how hard Danielle tried, no matter how polished her attempts at control had been, Elena was the one who had truly inherited her grandmother's spirit. Ethan stayed quiet. His thoughts were murky, clouded with the bitterness he had long suppressed. He didn't know how to respond, or even if he should. In the quiet corners of his mind, he couldn't help but feel the weight of loss, not just in material terms, but in something much deeper. Marietta had always been the one who filled the gaps, who provided, and now her absence was not just financial, it was emotional, irrevocable. Elena, for her part, had no need for their words or their approval. Her life had been shaped by the lessons Marietta had passed down, lessons she had always been too young to fully understand. Now, those lessons were her inheritance. And as her grandmother had taught her, it wasn't about claiming things. It was about building them, quietly, with no expectation of anything in return. A week later, Elena stood in front of a tattoo artist, her grandmother's final note etched into her memory, "Make them earn what they take." Elena held out her arm, the needle of the tattoo gun buzzing softly as the ink was permanently etched into her skin. It wasn't just a reminder. It was a commitment. She would carry this forward. The past had been built on taking, on manipulation. But she would build her own future, on her terms. The needle hummed as it worked, but the words weren't just on her skin. They were in her heart, steady, real, and unyielding. She would carry Marietta's legacy, not by blood, but by the strength of what they had built together, piece by piece. And in that moment, Elena knew that nothing her family had taken from her could ever be truly theirs. Not her grandmother's name, not her actions, not her legacy. It was hers to define. Elena sat at the kitchen table, the check in front of her. It was neatly folded, crisp, but it felt cold, like a weight that had no right to exist. She didn't even bother reading the number. She knew what it was for. A gesture, an attempt at compensation, or maybe something else entirely. It didn't matter. It was too little, too late. The check sat there for a moment, almost daring her to accept it, as though it could somehow undo everything. She didn't need it. She didn't need anything from them. Not their money, not their false offers of peace. Her fingers curled into a fist. Then, without a word, she tore the check in half. The sound of the paper splitting was a clean, deliberate action. She didn't flinch. There was no note accompanying it, no apology, no explanation, just guilt folded in paper. She felt no satisfaction in tearing it. It wasn't a victory. It was simply the last step in rejecting what had always been offered and never earned. She set the torn pieces of paper aside and reached for the copy of the will. She taped the remnants of the check to the back of it. The ink still clear, but the symbol of it now meaningless. She highlighted one line, the line that meant the most to her now, no restitution accepted. Her grandmother had made it clear this wasn't about money, about things. It was about something more, something deeper. The family had taken enough, and now it was Elena's turn to take control. A soft buzz on her phone interrupted her thoughts. It was Cole. "She wanted you to know," Cole's voice said when she picked up. His tone as steady as always. "She didn't die hurt. She died clear." Elena closed her eyes, feeling the finality of it wash over her. She didn't need to hear those words, not really. She had known her grandmother's mind, her strength, her decisions. Marietta had lived clear, and she had died with that clarity intact. It was why Elena had the strength to say no, to reject the offers that came from a place of guilt, not love. "I know," Elena whispered, her voice steady. "I know." She hung up, but the weight of Cole's words lingered. It was the final release, the last moment of emotional weight that had kept her tethered to the past. Now she was free to move forward. Later that week, Elena sat down to make a decision that felt like the only true tribute to her grandmother's legacy. She had inherited everything, but it wasn't her wealth that mattered. It was what she chose to do with it. She wrote out the donation, half her inheritance to elder care reform, in Marietta's name. It was an act of continuity, of passing forward the generosity Marietta had always lived by. The work that was unfinished would now be completed. The legacy wasn't in the things or the money, it was in the action. The following evening, Clara hosted a dinner, just the two of them, a bottle of Bordeaux, and the warmth of the garden around them. The night was cool, and the air smelled faintly of the flowers Marietta had once tended. Clara raised her glass first. "To Marietta," she said softly, her voice filled with both sorrow and admiration. "To the one woman who never begged to be remembered." Elena met her gaze, her eyes steady. She had never needed Marietta's love. She had never needed anyone's approval. The choices she had made, every single one of them, had been her own, forged in the quiet teachings her grandmother had left behind. And now, as the future spread out before her, Elena knew it was hers to shape. "To subtraction," Elena said, raising her glass. "Sometimes that's the real legacy." The two women clinked their glasses, the sound echoing softly in the still night. There was no fanfare, no recognition, no applause. Just the quiet satisfaction of knowing they had built something worth remembering. And as Elena took a slow sip of the wine, she allowed herself to feel the absence, the stillness. It was the absence of the past, of the weight of everything that had tried to hold her back. And it was the beginning of something new, something she would build from the ground up, just as Marietta had taught her. In the quiet of that garden, under the canopy of stars, Elna knew her future would never be defined by what had been taken from her. It would be defined by what she had the strength to create. Ethan and Danielle sat in silence, the refinancing papers spread out before them. The house, once buoyed by Marietta's support, was now a reminder of what they had lost. Without her financial help, their home had become just another weight, an obligation they could no longer afford. No more checks, no more bailouts. Their lives had shifted from comfort to survival, and the silence between them grew as the truth settled in. Marietta was gone, and with her, all the quiet, steady support she had offered them. There were no invitations to the nonprofit's gala, no seats at the church event. Marietta's legacy, her true impact, was now embodied in Elena. The nonprofit shared her contributions, while Elena's quiet generosity and clear vision became the new face of the family. Marietta had left a mark, but it was Elena who would carry it forward. Ethan and Danielle never mentioned Marietta's name again. It was as though the very mention of it would bring too much weight, too much truth to the surface. Instead, their house became a place of silence, where nothing was spoken but everything was felt. In contrast, Elena spoke of her grandmother often. She had taken on the task of cataloging Marietta's work at the Design Center, the collection of sketches, designs, and finished projects that had shaped her career. Elena was immersed in this quiet tribute, her grandmother's legacy now woven into her own. It wasn't about the money, it never had been. It was about the things that mattered, the work, the choices, the actions. In a recorded interview, Elena shared her thoughts on the legacy Marietta had left her. She didn't leave them nothing, she said, her voice steady. She left them a mirror. Those words resonated beyond the interview. Marietta's death had left behind not just possessions, but the raw reflection of Ethan and Danielle's choices, the choices they had made, the things they had taken for granted. Elena's words weren't just a statement, they were the truth, simple but profound. Danielle saw the interview. She felt the sting of being overshadowed, of losing not just Marietta's material wealth, but her quiet respect, her impact. The brand she had launched, one designed to fill the void Marietta's absence had created, crumbled within weeks. The backlash was swift, the criticisms overwhelming. People saw through the polished image. They saw the emptiness. Ethan, meanwhile, sat in quiet resignation. He didn't know what to feel. He didn't know if he should regret anything or if it was too late to fix it. Marietta had never asked for thanks, but she had always given. And now, in her absence, Ethan was left with the bitter realization that the things that had mattered, true generosity, quiet strength, were beyond his reach. In the meantime, Elena moved forward. She didn't need anyone's approval. She was already carving her own path, built on the lessons her grandmother had passed down. The legacy of action, not words, would be her inheritance. Elena knew what it meant to build something with purpose, without expectation. 1 week later, Elena stood in front of a tattoo artist. The words, "Make them earn what they take," already etched in her mind. She had inherited more than just wealth. She had inherited the clarity and strength to carve out her own future. And now, that future was in her hands. The flash drive arrived in a simple envelope, nothing remarkable about it. But for Elena, it was the last piece of her grandmother's legacy. A message that would live on beyond the quiet strength that Marietta had always exhibited. She had known, even before the final document, that there was more to Marietta's story than what they had all seen. And now, in this small file, she would hear her grandmother's voice, calm, direct, and final. The annual gala for the nonprofit was underway, a room filled with donors, supporters, and volunteers. Elena had chosen to stay in the back row, clutching the shawl her grandmother had worn so many times. The fabric, worn soft by years of use, felt like the last tangible connection to a woman who had never asked for recognition. She had given, and in the end, she had reclaimed everything, just as she'd planned. The lights dimmed, and the screen flickered to life. Marietta's image appeared, steady and resolute. Her voice, now a little distant but unmistakable, filled the room. "If they say they loved me, ask when. If they say they tried, ask how." The words hung in the air, their weight undeniable. The room fell silent. No one spoke, no one moved. The clarity of Marietta's statement echoed through the space, leaving a quiet impact on everyone who had gathered to celebrate her life. This wasn't a message for the public. This was a final statement, a declaration of everything she had always been. No pretense, no need for recognition, just the truth. As the video played, the audience seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't just a message for her family. It was for anyone who had ever taken her presence for granted. The power of her voice, even now, after her passing, was undeniable. She had lived on her terms, and now she would be remembered in exactly the same way. The applause was slow at first, tentative, as if no one quite knew how to react. But then it grew, louder and louder, until it was a standing ovation, a tribute to the woman who had given everything and in the end had chosen to stop. In stopping, she had reclaimed every piece of herself they had taken. Elena, still seated in the back row, allowed herself a quiet smile. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but one of quiet acknowledgement. Her grandmother had always understood the value of silence, the power of withdrawing when there was nothing left to give. And in this moment, Elena understood too. The ceremony moved forward, but Elena was lost in the weight of her thoughts. The video had only been part of the legacy. Marietta had never cared for grand gestures or public acknowledgement. She had given without expectation, and now her absence spoke louder than any of the accolades she had ever received. Later that evening, as the gala wound down, Elena remained, the last few guests slowly filtering out. The nonprofit's leaders approached her, thanking her for the gift Marietta had left. Elena nodded, her expression steady, her mind still on the legacy her grandmother had passed down. And then, they unveiled the final piece of the evening's tribute. Beneath the soft lights of the gala's central hall, a plaque was revealed, etched into stone, with a sculpture beside it. The sculpture depicted a woman standing tall, her form strong, unmoving, like the wind had shaped her into something timeless. The plaque, simple yet profound, read, "She gave, then she stopped." And in stopping, she reclaimed everything. The words weren't just a tribute. They were Marietta's final act of control. She had stopped giving when she realized that her legacy was no longer in what she could offer, but in what she had taken back. As Elena stood before the sculpture, her grandmother's words resonated deeply within her. They said they couldn't afford to care for me anymore, so I cut them from my will, my heart, and every comfort they ever took for granted. The finality of it hit Elena in waves, but she didn't flinch. This wasn't about anger or revenge. It was about strength. And now it was hers to carry forward. Elena turned to face the room, her eyes steady and filled with quiet resolve. She would live the legacy Marietta had given her, and she would do it without looking back. The room, still filled with echoes of applause and admiration, seemed smaller now. The past had been left behind, but the future? That was hers to shape. The final curtain had fallen on one era. Now, the legacy of Marietta Sloane was alive in her granddaughter, and the world would remember her, not by what she gave, but by the power of what she had taken back.